So the covenant concluded at Sinai is a climactic moment in the Pentateuchal narrative, and it came to be viewed as the initiation of God's articulation of the laws and rules and ordinances and instruction by which the ancient Israelites were to live. And so later editors consequently inserted law collections from later times and circles into the story of Israel's meeting with God at Sinai and subsequent sojourn in the wilderness. This was done in order to lend these collections an air of high antiquity and to give them divine sponsorship. The conclusion of biblical scholarship is that a number of separate bodies of law have gravitated to the story of the 40-year period of Israel's formation into a people. So that's the period of the covenant at Mount Sinai and then the journey towards the promised land. All Israelite law is represented in the biblical account as having issued from that time, that 40-year period of intimate contact between God and Israel. So on your handout, I've given a rough division of the different legal collections that we have in the Pentateuch. The laws that scholars will often refer to as the J.E. laws, since they sort of are introduced by that narrative. Some people think it's best to just think of these as separate legal collections, but those occur in Exodus. And so they tend to be dated 10th, 9th century in their written form. The laws of the priestly material are mostly going to be found in Leviticus and Numbers, and those will be formulated somewhere from the 8th to the 6th century. Same period of time, roughly, we have the laws of D, which are found, obviously, in Deuteronomy. But these sources themselves are clearly drawing upon much older traditions. Some of the individual laws are clearly quite ancient. They have a great deal in common with ancient Near Eastern legal traditions generally of the second millennium. The laws of Exodus, for example, some of them bear such similarity to the Code of Hammurabi that we can really assume that they are drawing upon a common legal heritage, a Canaanite law, what would have been known as a legal tradition in Canaan. So whatever their actual origin, however, the Bible represents these materials as having been given at Sinai or during that 40-year period after. So given at Sinai, now this is on your sheet, you have the Decalogue, not very well translated as the Ten Commandments, we'll come back to that. Covenant Code, so that's a chunk of material, 3 chapters in Exodus. Then we have a small passage referred to as a ritual decalogue, we'll come back to that. You have priestly legislation, a little bit in Exodus about the cult, obviously, then on into Leviticus and some Numbers. And according to the biblical narrative then, the following materials were given in the 40 years after Sinai, as the Israelites are encamped in the wilderness on their journey toward the land of Israel. So those are presented as supplements in Numbers, but also the Deuteronomic Code. Let's talk a little bit now about the Decalogue. There was a scholar by the name of Alt, A-L-T, Albrecht Alt, German scholar, who examined the legal material of the Bible in general. And he noticed that there were really 2 forms of law. Yeah, well, these things I forgot to write down. There's conditional law and apodictic law. Conditional law is case law, casuistic law, and then there's absolute or apodictic law. So casuistic, he noticed these 2 forms. Casuistic law is the common form of law that law takes in ancient Near East, and you've seen it in the Code of Hammurabi. It has a characteristic if-then pattern. Casuistic law tells you, for example, if a person does X, or if X happens, then Y will be the consequence. It can be complex, it can be quite specific. If X happens, Y is the consequence, but if X happens under these different circumstances, then Z is the consequence. And it can be quite detailed, giving 3 or 4 sub-cases with qualifications. Absolute or apodictic law, by contrast, is an unconditional statement of a prohibition or a command. It tends to be general and somewhat undifferentiated. You shall not murder. You shall love the Lord your God. An absolute law, apodictic law, is not unknown as a form in other ancient Near Eastern cultures, but it seems to be most characteristically Israelite. We find a great deal more of it in our legal collections in the Bible than anywhere else. The provisions of the Decalogue, and again, the translation 10 Commandments is actually a very poor translation. In the Hebrew, it simply means 10 statements, 10 utterances. These are in, the ones that are in some sort of legal form, are in absolute or apodictic form. The Decalogue is the only part of God's revelation that is disclosed directly to all of Israel without an intermediary. But its directives are couched in the masculine singular, so it seems to be addressing Israelite males as the legal subjects in the community. And the Decalogue sets out some of God's most basic and unconditional covenant demands. The division into 10 is a bit awkward. It probably should be seen as an ideal number, an effort to find 10 statements in there, because in fact there are really about 13 separate statements, and we see the fact that 10 doesn't work very well in a very interesting phenomenon, which is that so-called commandments are actually numbered differently by Jews and by Christians, and then even within the Christian community, different Christian denominations number the commandments 1 through 10 quite differently from one another. They disagree about what is number 1 and what is number 2 and so on. The first statements, either 1 through 4 or 1 through 5, depending on your counting, but the first group of statements concern Israel's relationship with her suzerain, with God. She is to be exclusively faithful to God. She's not to bow down to any man-made image. She may not use God's name in a false oath, right, to attest to or swear by a false oath. She's to honor God's Sabbath day and honor parental authority, which is arguably an extension of God's authority. The remaining statements then concern Israel's relationship with her fellow vassals, if you will, and they prohibit murder and adultery and robbery, false testimony, and covetousness. It's important to realize that the Pentateuch contains 3 versions of the Decalogue, and there are differences among them. The Decalogue is going to be repeated in Deuteronomy, chapter 5, and there are some minor variations. Specifically, you'll see that the rationale for observing the Sabbath is different. God's name in Deuteronomy 5 is not to be used in a vain oath as opposed to a false oath. There are differences in the meaning. And there are some more differences, too, in language. So what are we to make of this? One scholar, Mark Brettler, whose name I've mentioned before, he says that what we learn from this, or these variations, is something about the way ancient Israel preserved and transmitted sacred texts. They didn't strive for verbatim preservation when they transmitted biblical texts, and they didn't employ cut and paste methods that might be important to us in the transmission of something. Texts were modified in the course of their transmission. Verbatim repetition was not valued in the way that it might be for us, so that even a text like the Decalogue, which is represented as being the unmediated Word of God, can appear in more than one version. There's a more surprising variation that occurs, however, in Exodus 34. After smashing the first set of tablets that were inscribed with the Decalogue, the tablets in Exodus 20, those are smashed after the golden calf incident. Moses is then given a second set of tablets, and the biblical writer emphasizes in the story at that point that God writes on the tablets the words that were on the former tablets that were broken, the same words. So we expect now a verbatim repetition of Exodus 20. And yet we don't have it. The Decalogue that follows, in fact, has very little overlap with the earlier Decalogue. There's really only 2 statements that even have the same content. And even those which do overlap in content vary in wording. This Decalogue, which is often called the ritual Decalogue, so it's listed on there in Exodus 34, it bans intermarriage with Canaanites, lest they entice the Israelites into worship of their gods. It has other terms that give commandments about the observance of the festivals, various festivals, the dedication of first fruits to God, the dedication of firstborn animals to God, and so on, things that were not in the Exodus 20 Decalogue. So evidently there were different traditions regarding the contents of the Decalogue. And the story of the golden calf and Moses' destruction of the first set of tablets is a brilliant narrative strategy for introducing this second Decalogue tradition. Also surprising is the fact that the Decalogue in Exodus 20 doesn't stand completely unchallenged in the Bible. Exodus 20, verses 5 through 6, contain explicitly the principle of intergenerational punishment. God is said to spread punishment for sin out over 3 or 4 generations. This is understood as a sign of his mercy. It's reducing the punishment on the actual sinner by spreading it out and limiting the consequences to only 3 or 4 generations, in contrast to what is said in the next verse, but kindness he spreads out over thousands of generations, right? So it's seen as a merciful mode of operation. But the notion of intergenerational punishment is something that some segments of the community, or perhaps later in time, was rejected, right? Some segments of the community rejected this notion. And so in Deuteronomy 7, we see that quite pointedly. God punishes only those who spurn him and does so instantly. Ezekiel, when we get to Ezekiel, we'll see that he will also very adamantly reject the idea of intergenerational punishment. The children do not suffer for the sins of the father, only the father. So what are we to make of this? Again, Mark Brettler concludes that the Decalogue, or Decalogues, did not originally possess the absolute authority that is so often claimed for it, even today. Later religious traditions have elevated the Decalogue in Exodus 20 to a position of absolute authority, a position that's not completely justified given the Bible's own fluid treatment of the wording, right, the Decalogue's text, and its content, right, and its later objection even to one of its terms. So the claim that God's revelation of the Decalogue was fixed in form, the words that we see in Exodus 20, for example, and immutable in substance, is not a claim that's really native to or even justified by the biblical text. It's a later ideological imposition upon the text.